What were the soul foods that held Black America together in hard times? These foods filled empty stomachs, stretched scraps into meals, and gave families the strength to face each day. But beyond the plates, what deeper stories of survival still linger in their memory? Cowpea fritters were a dish that came straight out of resilience and memory, with roots reaching back to African cooking traditions. Families would soak and mash dried cowpeas, mix them with a little onion, cornmeal, and seasoning, then fry the mixture in hot lard until crisp on the outside and soft inside. They were cheap, filling, and carried the rich protein that many households could not always get from meat. For Black families in the South, cowpeas were already a staple crop, so using them to create something hearty made perfect sense. These fritters could be eaten plain or dipped in gravy, and they were often made in batches large enough to last a day or two. They carried a deep sense of history, because this kind of cooking showed how old world techniques adapted to the realities of hard times in America. They were not only nourishment, but also a connection to ancestors who had relied on the same beans for strength. Sorghum syrup bread was a wartime and Depression-era answer to expensive refined sugar. Sorghum, a tall grass grown widely in the South, was boiled down into a thick, dark syrup that tasted earthy and sweet. Families would use it in place of sugar, mixing it into simple bread doughs to stretch rations and still enjoy something satisfying. Sorghum syrup bread was hearty, with a flavor that carried a touch of bitterness, but warmed the spirit. Children often slathered slices with butter or drippings, while adults enjoyed it with strong coffee. It was a farm food at its core, tied directly to the fields where sorghum stalks grew. Sorghum bread meant that no one had to give up sweetness completely even when sugar prices were too high or stores ran out. This loaf was practical, easy to make at home, and deeply tied to southern soil. After times of scarcity passed, sorghum faded, but the memory of that dark bread stayed. Stewed okra and tomatoes were the kind of dish that took simple garden produce and turned it into something nourishing enough to feed a family. Okra, a vegetable with African origins, thrived in southern soil, while tomatoes grew easily in backyard gardens. Together, simmered slowly with onions, spices, and sometimes a scrap of salt pork, they created a stew that was tangy, savory, and thick. Families relied on it because it stretched small harvests into larger meals, often served over rice or with cornbread to make it filling. The dish was especially important when meat was too expensive to buy, as it added depth and nutrition without needing animal protein. Stewed okra and tomatoes became more than food. They were a way to survive with what the land provided. For many, the taste carried reminders of summer gardens and the hard work it took to keep families fed. It was frugal, delicious, and a perfect example of survival cooking. Fried corn pone was a dish that required almost nothing but cornmeal, water, and lard, yet it managed to fill stomachs during times of want. It was denser than cornbread and more rustic, formed into small patties and fried in cast-iron skillets until golden. Families leaned on it for breakfast, lunch, or supper because it was inexpensive, used ingredients they almost always had, and could be made quickly. Corn was abundant across the South, and every pantry had a sack of cornmeal that could be stretched into meals again and again. Eating fried corn pone often meant there was no wheat bread to be had, but no one went hungry. It was eaten with beans, dipped in potlikker, or just on its own with a smear of molasses or syrup if available. Fried corn pone reflected the determination to create something warm and satisfying even when the cupboards were close to bare. Chicken neck gravy was the very definition of stretching scraps into a full meal. Poultry was expensive and few families could afford large cuts, so nothing from a chicken ever went to waste. Necks were simmered slowly to release every bit of flavor, then thickened into a gravy with flour and drippings. Poured over rice, mashed potatoes, or biscuits, it transformed the cheapest part of the bird into something filling and comforting. Families looked forward to it because it stretched one bird into several meals, ensuring nothing was thrown away. This kind of resourcefulness defined survival cooking, and for many Black families in the South, it was routine. Chicken neck gravy might not have been glamorous, but it represented pride in making the most out of very little. It also carried the feeling of home, the scent of gravy simmering on the stove, and the relief of knowing everyone at the table would leave fed. Boiled peanuts may sound like a simple snack, but they carried deep meaning during times when money was short. Fresh green peanuts were harvested from fields and boiled slowly in salted water until soft, turning them into something filling and protein-rich. They were sold by street vendors, shared at church gatherings, and eaten hot from pots on family stoves. The salty, earthy flavor made them addictive, and because peanuts were relatively inexpensive, they became a food that was both affordable and sustaining. For many Black families, boiled peanuts represented community and togetherness as much as they did thrift. They were eaten by hand, cracked open while people talked, sang, or worked, making them a food tied closely to everyday life. In hard times, they were cheap enough to feel like a small luxury, a treat that was still practical. Boiled peanuts became more than food. They were a shared memory, passed down across generations. Collard green Potlikker soup was proof that nothing in the kitchen went to waste. After collard greens were boiled with ham hocks or smoked meat, the leftover broth was packed with nutrients and flavor. Families would save it, thicken it with beans, rice, or cornbread crumbs, and serve it as a soup. It turned what could have been discarded liquid into a meal that could stretch for days. Potlikker was praised for its richness and vitamins, especially during times when fresh vegetables were limited. Black families in the South cherished it as part of their food culture, a reminder that even scraps held value. The taste of Potlikker soup was smoky, salty, and comforting, carrying both sustenance and heritage in every bowl. It reminded people that resourcefulness was a form of survival and strength. For many households, it was a dish that fed both body and spirit when times were most difficult. Sweet potato biscuits with honey were a beloved comfort food that turned humble ingredients into something special. Sweet potatoes were plentiful in the South, cheap to grow, and full of natural sweetness. By mashing them into biscuit dough, families created soft, tender breads that did not require as much flour or fat. Fresh biscuits out of the oven were topped with a drizzle of local honey if it was available, making them feel indulgent despite their simplicity. These biscuits were often served for breakfast, but they could also accompany stews or fried fish. They filled stomachs and brought warmth to the table, offering both nutrition and comfort. Sweet potatoes symbolized resilience, and honey added a touch of hope in difficult times. Together, they created a dish that carried meaning well beyond its taste. Sweet potato biscuits with honey reflected the heart of soul food, making something beautiful and memorable from ingredients that were always within reach. Pickled watermelon rind was a dish born out of a waste-not spirit. When families ate fresh watermelon, they saved the rinds, slicing off the tough green skin and brining the white flesh in vinegar, sugar, and spices. The result was a tangy, sweet pickle that could be eaten alongside meats, beans, or cornbread. In hard times, nothing edible was thrown away, and this recipe proved that even scraps could become something delicious. Pickled rind added brightness to plates that were otherwise heavy with starch and salt, lifting meals and making them feel more balanced. Children loved the odd flavor, and adults appreciated that it stretched food supplies further. Pickled watermelon rind became common in many Southern households, passed down as a recipe of ingenuity. It turned what was once destined for the trash into something cherished, embodying the creativity of Black families making do with what they had. Catfish stew was a hearty dish that brought riverside living directly into the kitchen. Catfish was plentiful in southern waters and could be caught by hand or with simple nets, making it accessible to families with little money. The fish was simmered in a tomato-based broth with onions, peppers, and sometimes potatoes, creating a stew that was filling and flavorful. Served with rice or cornbread, it became a meal that could feed many people from just a few ingredients. Catfish stew represented more than thrift. It symbolized self-sufficiency and the ability to survive off the land and water. For Black families, it was also a dish tied to community, as fishing trips often brought people together. The stew carried smoky, tangy flavors that warmed the soul, reminding everyone at the table of home. In times of hardship, catfish stew was both sustenance and tradition. feeding generations with simple but powerful nourishment. Cornmeal batter cakes were one of the simplest meals that could appear on a Southern table, and they carried generations of tradition within them. Families would take cornmeal, water, and sometimes a pinch of salt, stir it into a thin batter, and fry it on a hot griddle until crisp at the edges. They were plain, but they filled stomachs and could be eaten with molasses, honey, or drippings if there was any to spare. For children heading to school or workers starting long days in the fields, these cakes offered quick energy without costing much. Cornmeal was one of the most dependable ingredients because it was cheap, easy to store, and produced in abundance across the South. A few scoops stretched further than wheat flour, and it did not require yeast or fancy preparation. Cornmeal batter cakes might have been plain, but in households facing hunger, they meant survival and warmth. They were a food that held families steady when little else did. Pig ear sandwiches were another example of how Black families wasted nothing and found flavor where others saw scraps. Pig ears, which butchers often sold cheaply, were boiled until tender, then sliced thin and placed between bread with mustard or hot sauce. The texture was chewy, but the taste was rich and savory, making them surprisingly satisfying. For many, these sandwiches became a dependable lunch or supper when more expensive meats were out of reach. They were especially common in rural towns where hogs were butchered at home and every part of the animal was used. Families knew that wasting nothing was not just thrifty, it was survival. Eating pig ears was also a mark of resilience, turning overlooked cuts into a food that people grew to enjoy. Today, pig ear sandwiches are remembered as a dish born from necessity, but filled with pride, showing just how much strength could be found in the humblest of meals. Hogmaw stew was a dish that took something most would discard and transformed it into a centerpiece for the table. Hogmaw, the lining of a pig's stomach, was cleaned carefully, then stuffed with potatoes, onions, and spices before being simmered until tender. The result was hearty, filling, and deeply flavorful, stretching small amounts of ingredients into a meal that could feed an entire family. In times when money was scarce, Hogmaw stew allowed families to make use of what they had, proving that nothing from the animal went to waste. It was often served at gatherings where one pot had to go far, reminding everyone of the value of sharing and stretching food. The dish carried cultural roots tied to both survival and celebration, a reminder that even hard times could produce food that comforted and united. Hogmaw stew was not fancy, but it represented ingenuity, thrift, and strength in the face of want. Turnip and potato hash was a skillet meal that worked wonders when meat was scarce or simply unavailable. Families would dice turnips and potatoes, fry them together in drippings or lard, and season them with onions, salt, and pepper. The combination produced a dish that was both hearty and inexpensive, making it a frequent breakfast or supper in households trying to stretch limited supplies. Turnips were especially important because they were cheap, easy to grow, and available in gardens or local markets. Blended with potatoes, they created bulk without requiring meat to make a plate feel substantial. This hash was also flexible, with families adding whatever scraps of vegetables they had on hand to improve flavor. Though simple, it offered warmth and familiarity to those who often faced uncertainty at mealtime. Turnip and potato hash might not have been glamorous, but it carried families through tough years and gave comfort with every bite. Molasses milk drink was a common way to stretch both sweeteners and dairy during times of hardship. Hot milk, often reconstituted from powdered milk, was whisked with a spoonful of molasses until warm and smooth. The result was a drink that children could have before school or adults could sip before long workdays. It carried natural sweetness and important nutrients from molasses, while offering comfort when sugar was too costly to use. Families appreciated it because it was affordable, easy to prepare, and nourishing. Many children who grew up during lean times remembered this drink as both a treat and a necessity, even if they preferred chocolate or sugar when they could get it. The molasses milk drink proved that small substitutions could keep sweetness alive in daily life without breaking ration limits. It was simple, practical, and tied directly to the struggles of everyday survival, becoming a quiet but important memory of perseverance. Crowder pea stew was a variant of black-eyed peas that found its way into countless kitchens during hard years. Crowder peas, smaller and creamier than black-eyed peas, were simmered down with onions, peppers, and bits of smoked meat if any were available. The stew was thick, filling, and high in protein, making it essential for families who needed food that stretched far. Served with cornbread or rice, Crowder pea stew could feed many mouths at little cost. It was one of those dishes that reflected the ingenuity of turning simple legumes into full meals that carried flavor and strength. The stew also tied into a long history of peas as a staple in African and Southern food traditions. Families leaned on it not only because it was affordable, but because it was familiar and comforting. Crowder pea stew was more than food. It was a lifeline and a cultural anchor in times of scarcity. Homemade cracklins were a prized treat made from pork skins, fried until golden and crisp. Families would render down hog fat and save the skins, cutting them into pieces that crackled in hot lard as they cooked. The result was crunchy, salty, and deeply flavorful, often eaten with cornbread or sprinkled over greens. Nothing went to waste, and cracklins were proof of how families found ways to enjoy even the humblest scraps. They carried a strong connection to hog butchering days, when entire communities gathered to process a hog and share every part of it. Cracklins added texture and flavor to otherwise plain meals, and for many, they were a reminder of both thrift and celebration. Though inexpensive, they carried a sense of richness and taste that lifted spirits. Homemade cracklins showed how food could be both practical and deeply satisfying, even in the hardest of times. Souse, also known as head cheese, was a dish made from pig scraps that turned thrift into sustenance. The meat from a pig's head, including tongue and cheeks, was simmered, chopped, and set in a broth with vinegar and spices. Once cooled, it formed a terrine-like dish that could be sliced and served cold, usually with bread. Families valued it because it made use of parts of the hog that others ignored, ensuring that nothing edible was wasted. Souse carried tangy flavors from the vinegar and a dense texture that was filling and practical. Though not everyone loved it, those who grew up with it remembered it as a staple on the table during lean times. It represented survival and ingenuity, transforming scraps into something lasting. In households where every bite mattered, Souse stood as proof that determination and resourcefulness could make even the most overlooked cuts into meaningful food. Field green salad was a dish born from foraging, when store-bought vegetables were not available or were too costly. Families would gather wild greens like dandelion, mustard, or pokeweed, clean them carefully, and toss them with vinegar or oil. These greens were bitter, but they were free, nutritious, and available almost everywhere. Field green salad offered vitamins and freshness that was often missing from wartime or depression diets, balancing the heavy starches and salted meats that dominated many meals. For children, it was sometimes an acquired taste, but adults appreciated the practicality of gathering what nature provided. Foraging for greens tied families directly to the land and created a sense of connection to survival practices passed down through generations. Field green salad reflected both hardship and resilience, reminding families that the earth itself could provide when markets could not. It was simple, frugal, and a reminder of the strength that came from resourcefulness. Smoked turkey necks with beans were a dish that carried deep, smoky flavor into a pot of humble legumes. Turkey necks were affordable and often overlooked at markets, making them perfect for families who needed cheap protein. Simmered slowly with beans, onions, and peppers, the necks released flavor that transformed plain beans into a rich, hearty stew. The meat could be picked from the bones and mixed back in, ensuring that nothing was wasted. This dish was particularly popular in the South, where smoked meats were prized for their ability to season large pots of food. Served with cornbread, it provided warmth and satisfaction that carried families through long days. Smoked turkey necks with beans became a reminder that flavor did not depend on expensive cuts, but on patience and tradition. It was food that spoke to both survival and comfort, feeding bodies and spirits in difficult years. Corn husk tamales in the Delta carried a story of adaptation and resilience, blending African-American creativity with Mexican influence. Families filled corn husks with seasoned cornmeal dough and sometimes small bits of pork or vegetables, then simmered them slowly until firm. They were portable, hearty, and could stretch a handful of ingredients into meals for many. In the Delta, these tamales became a community staple, often sold from wagons or small kitchens to neighbors who could not afford restaurant food. Wrapped in corn husks, they represented thrift and tradition, proof that families could borrow from other foodways and make it their own. Tamales were often shared at gatherings or passed around during long workdays, feeding both body and spirit. They carried the memory of cornfields and the smell of simmering pots, becoming part of African-American culinary history. Delta tamales showed that even in hard times, food could carry flavor, heritage, and strength into the lives of those who needed it most. Peanut soup had deep roots in West African cooking and carried over into the kitchens of Black America during times of scarcity. Families would boil peanuts until soft, grind them into a paste, and whisk them into broth with onions and seasonings. The result was a creamy, nutty soup that filled stomachs without relying on expensive meat. Because peanuts were widely available and inexpensive, this dish became a dependable source of protein and comfort. It could be served plain with bread or thickened with vegetables to stretch even further. Children grew up tasting peanut soup as a warm, sustaining dish that soothed hunger while carrying the echo of older traditions. The flavor was earthy and satisfying, reminding families of both resilience and cultural roots. Peanut soup showed that the most affordable ingredients could still produce something memorable, sustaining entire households during difficult seasons. It was not just soup, it was survival food with heritage poured into every bowl. Stewed rutabagas were a staple in southern kitchens during lean years, a root vegetable that could be boiled down and flavored with pork fat for depth. Rutabagas were cheap, stored well through the winter, and filled in for potatoes when those were too expensive or scarce. Families would peel, chop, and simmer them until tender, often serving them alongside beans or cornbread to complete a meal. The dish was hearty without being costly, and it carried a slightly sweet, earthy flavor that grew familiar to children who had little else on their plates. Pork fat or drippings were often added to give richness, turning the humble root into something more comforting. Stewed rutabagas became a dish tied to survival, reflecting both garden ingenuity and frugality. They were not glamorous, but they were dependable, and that mattered most. For many families, a pot of rutabagas simmering on the stove was the scent of perseverance. They represented sustenance and simplicity in the hardest of times. Sugar cane sticks were the simplest kind of sweetness, and they carried a special memory for children who grew up with little. Fresh cane was cut into sticks, peeled, and chewed for its sweet juice, offering a natural candy when refined sugar or store-bought treats were out of reach. For many children in the South, walking home with a stick of sugar cane was as good as holding a chocolate bar. It was affordable, long-lasting, and carried the earthy, raw sweetness of the land itself. Parents loved it because it kept children happy without costing much, and it taught the value of finding joy in small things. Sugar cane sticks carried the reminder that sweetness did not need to come from a store, but from fields worked by hand. They were part of the rhythm of rural life, tied to harvests and family memories. Even in the toughest years, sugar cane sticks brought happiness. Cowtail soup was a rustic dish that turned overlooked parts of the animal into a rich, sustaining meal. Families would simmer ox or cow tails for hours until the broth thickened, drawing out deep flavors from the bones and marrow. Vegetables like carrots, onions, and potatoes were added when available, creating a stew that was filling and full of nutrients. Cowtail soup was a dish of patience, requiring time but rewarding households with warmth and nourishment that could last days. It carried a strong, hearty flavor that reminded families of home cooking, even in years when food was scarce. Because tails were cheaper than prime cuts, they became an accessible protein source for families who could not afford much. The soup symbolized frugality and resourcefulness, proving that even bones could be transformed into meals that held people together. Cowtail soup was more than broth. It was the taste of resilience in hard times. Homemade vinegar pie was a dessert that showed just how clever cooks could be in the face of scarcity. With fruit hard to come by, families learned to create a pie filling from vinegar, sugar, butter, and flour, which baked into a sweet, tangy custard-like dessert. It was not the same as apple or lemon, but it offered brightness and sweetness when nothing else was available. Vinegar pie became a symbol of ingenuity, proof that even pantry staples could turn into something special. Served at Sunday dinners or holidays, it gave families a sense of normalcy when times were anything but normal. The taste was surprising, tart yet sweet, simple yet memorable. Families passed recipes down through word of mouth, and many children remembered vinegar pie as the dessert that made hard days feel less heavy. It carried the message that joy and resourcefulness could coexist in the kitchen. Vinegar pie became a reminder of how far determination could stretch. Ash cakes were one of the oldest and simplest forms of survival food, baked directly in the ashes of a fire. Cornmeal dough was shaped into patties, placed in hot embers, and brushed clean once cooked. They were smoky, rustic, and filling, often eaten with molasses or a bit of lard if available. Ash cakes reflected a time when ovens were not always accessible and fire was the only tool families had. They were practical and symbolic, tied to centuries of African American resilience and the resourceful use of corn. Families leaned on ash cakes during journeys, hard work days, and lean years, carrying both history and sustenance in every bite. Eating them meant returning to the most basic form of nourishment, stripped of luxury but full of meaning. Ash cakes were humble food that carried dignity, a reminder that even in the most limited circumstances, people found ways to survive and share. Peach preserves with biscuits brought the sweetness of summer into the cold months of winter. Families would boil down ripe peaches with sugar until thick, sealing them in jars to last through the year. Spread over hot biscuits, the preserves offered both comfort and nourishment when fresh fruit was long gone. Canning peaches was a yearly ritual, tying families to the cycles of the land and the rhythm of harvest. It required time and patience, but the reward was sweetness that carried through the hardest seasons. Biscuits were a perfect partner, soft, warm, and filling, making peach preserves a special treat that brightened tables. For children, it was a taste of abundance in months of scarcity, a reminder that summer fruit could still be enjoyed when snow or frost covered the fields. Peach preserves with biscuits were both practical and emotional, offering joy from jars of hard work. They carried hope through cold winters. Fried rabbit was a dish that came from necessity when families could not afford store-bought meat. Rabbits were plentiful in rural areas, and children often learned to hunt them with traps or small rifles. Once cleaned, the meat was seasoned, dredged in flour or cornmeal, and fried in hot lard until crisp. Rabbit meat was lean but tender, and it provided a valuable source of protein at no cost beyond effort. Families relied on it to fill gaps in their diets, especially during years when hogs or chickens were too expensive to raise in number. Fried rabbit was often served with potatoes or greens, turning it into a complete meal. It carried memories of resourcefulness, where survival was tied directly to skill and the land's offerings. For many, fried rabbit represented both struggle and pride, proof that families could take care of themselves when markets and money failed them. It was a food of resilience. Hoop cheese with cornbread was a combination that felt special even though it was simple. Hoop cheese, a fresh, firm cheese pressed into round molds, was cheap and sold in local stores or from wagons. Paired with hot cornbread, it created a meal that was filling, wholesome, and comforting. Hoop cheese was not always available, which made it a rare treat in some households, something to be savored when it could be afforded. Cornbread, however, was always on the table, making the pairing feel like an upgrade from the everyday. The salty, tangy cheese balanced the sweetness of fresh cornmeal bread, creating a taste that lingered long in memory. Hoop cheese with cornbread reminded families that even small luxuries mattered, lifting spirits during times of hardship. It was proof that joy could be found in simple pairings, even in kitchens with little to spare. For many, it was comfort in its purest form. Corncob jelly turned what most people threw away into a shimmering golden spread that brightened plain breads and biscuits. After kernels were cut from the cob for other uses, the remaining cores were boiled for a long time to draw out natural starch and pectin. The liquid was strained, sweetened with a modest amount of sugar or honey when available, and cooked again until it thickened into a soft jelly with a delicate corn flavor. Enslaved cooks perfected this transformation, ensuring nothing went to waste and every scrap contributed to nourishment. Long after emancipation, rural homesteaders and Depression-era families embraced corncob jelly as a thrifty delicacy, and it still appears at Southern craft fairs and heritage festivals. The gentle sweetness and faintly toasted aroma offer a taste of memory and ingenuity. Corncob jelly proves that culinary creativity can turn the most humble remnants of the harvest into something beautiful, a spread that honors the perseverance of those who found flavor and comfort in the very parts of the plant others overlooked. Homemade cane. Syrup drizzle once gave biscuits and pancakes a dark, smoky sweetness unmatched by refined sugar. Families would harvest sugarcane, crush the stalks, and boil the juice in large iron kettles until it thickened into a rich amber syrup. The work was hot and sticky, often stretching from dawn until late night, but the reward was a flavor that defined Southern breakfasts and holiday treats. Children watched the bubbling kettles with wide eyes, waiting for a chance to taste the warm syrup on a fresh biscuit. Neighbors often shared the labor and the finished product, turning the syrup-making into a community event as well as a culinary one. Over time, industrial sweeteners and store-bought syrups replaced the careful craft, and the knowledge of how to coax sweetness from cane faded with older generations. For those who remember, a spoonful of homemade cane syrup is more than a taste. It is a memory of family unity, hard work, and the sweetness that perseverance can bring. Pork cracklin cornbread was a dish that made even a simple pan of bread feel like a celebration. Cracklins, small, crispy bits left from rendering pork fat, were cheap to come by and packed with flavor. My grandmother folded them into cornbread batter, the fat melting and the crunchy pieces scattering through every slice. Baked until golden, it came out hearty and rich, with texture that plain cornbread never had. The salty pork balanced the sweet cornmeal, making each bite feel indulgent even though the ingredients were inexpensive. Families sliced it thick and ate it alone or alongside beans, greens, or stews, letting the cracklins carry the flavor of meat through the whole meal. In the 1960s, this kind of dish made families feel proud, as though they had something special on the table despite the hardships around them. Pork cracklin cornbread was thrift turned into joy, simple food lifted by the spirit of making do. Chinquapin nut cakes offered small moments of sweetness, created from the rich forests of the American South. The Chinquapin, a dwarf chestnut native to the region, produced small, sweet nuts that could be eaten raw or roasted. Enslaved families collected these nuts in autumn, cracked their shells, and ground the meat into a fine meal. Mixed with a little cornmeal, honey, or molasses when available, the nut meal formed small cakes that were baked or cooked on a griddle until golden brown. These cakes carried both nutrition and a sense of celebration, providing rare treats for special gatherings. The flavor, slightly sweeter than a chestnut with a buttery finish, became a cherished memory passed down through generations. Even after emancipation, Chinquapin nuts remained a prized wild harvest in Appalachian and Southern communities, though the trees have grown scarce in modern times. Chinquapin nut cakes remind us of the connection between forest abundance and human creativity, transforming a foraged ingredient into a dessert that honored both the landscape and the people who carefully tended its secrets. Field pea salad with hot pepper vinegar offered a cool bite for the hottest southern evenings. Tender field peas were boiled until just soft, then chilled and tossed with diced onions, sweet peppers, and a splash of sharp vinegar infused with fiery peppers. The salad balanced earthy legumes with a bright tang that woke the palate after long days in the sun. Served on wide porches as cicadas sang, it accompanied fried chicken, grilled fish, or simply a hunk of cornbread. Home gardeners prized field peas for their reliability in poor soil, And the vinegar peppers were often homemade, steeped for weeks in glass bottles on sunny windowsills. Guests at summer suppers remembered the sting of the vinegar and the gentle sweetness of the peas as the taste of true Southern hospitality. Today, packaged beans and bottled dressings have replaced the careful soaking and seasoning that once defined the dish, but the memory of its crisp, refreshing bite lingers in kitchens where tradition still holds strong. Fish head stew was a dish born out of necessity, yet it carried surprising depth and flavor. Fish heads, often discarded by others, were simmered slowly with onions, potatoes, and rice until they yielded every ounce of richness to the broth. My grandmother insisted the heads made the stew better than fillies, providing body and nourishment that nothing else could. The bones and skin flavored the liquid until it turned hearty and comforting. Potatoes stretched the meal, rice thickened it, and vegetables added substance, turning scraps into a filling supper. The taste was strong, earthy, and unforgettable, reminding everyone that no part of food should go unused. For Black families in the 1960s, fish head stew was a common way to stretch the catch of the day, ensuring nothing went to waste. It became a lesson in thrift and gratitude, proof that survival demanded creativity. Fish head stew was both humble and mighty, sustaining families through lean times with flavor and tradition. Red drink. Juneteenth punch flowed like a symbol of freedom and memory at community celebrations marking emancipation. Made from hibiscus petals or bright strawberries steeped into a deep crimson infusion, the drink stood for resilience and the blood of those who fought for liberation. Families would gather in churchyards and town squares, pouring the sweet, tangy liquid into simple cups while music and laughter filled the warm June air. Children chased each other between picnic tables as elders told the story of the first Juneteenth, reminding everyone of the hard-won joy behind the holiday. The punch often carried a gentle spice from cloves or ginger, offering a flavor both refreshing and layered, much like the history it honored. Preparing the drink was as important as drinking it, with women and men alike contributing fruit, sugar, and labor to the cause. Though some communities still keep the tradition alive, many younger generations have never tasted the vibrant red drink that once defined a day of remembrance and celebration. Roasted sassafras roots provided a fragrant tea with a naturally sweet, slightly spicy flavor that refreshed the spirit and offered mild stimulation. Enslaved gatherers carefully dug the young roots of the sassafras tree, washed them, and roasted them over gentle heat to draw out their aromatic oils. When steeped in hot water, the roasted roots released a deep reddish brew with notes of vanilla and citrus. This tea was enjoyed both for its taste and for traditional medicinal uses, reflecting a blend of African and indigenous knowledge about native plants. After emancipation, sassafras tea became a beloved Southern beverage, eventually serving as the base flavor for the first root beers. The practice demonstrates how a simple foraged root shaped a lasting American flavor that extends far beyond its humble beginnings. Roasted sassafras roots show how understanding the forest's offerings allowed communities to create drinks of comfort and cultural significance from ingredients freely given by the land itself. Stewed oxtails with rice gravy brought deep flavor and slow-cooked richness to Sunday tables across many African American communities. Oxtails, once inexpensive and overlooked, were browned in heavy pots and then simmered for hours with onions, garlic, and spices until the meat turned buttery soft. The braising liquid thickened into a silky gravy that clung to each grain of rice, creating a dish that was equal parts comfort and celebration. Families saved this meal for weekends when everyone could gather because patience was essential and conversation flowed while the pot worked its magic. Children sneaked tastes from wooden spoons, drawn by the savory aroma that filled the house from morning until evening. The humble tale, once discarded by butchers, became a centerpiece of pride and ingenuity. Today, rising prices and faster cooking habits mean fewer people take the time to coax such tenderness from a simple cut of beef, but those who remember the meal speak of it as a perfect union of thrift, skill, and the slow rhythm of family life. Shepherd's pie with mashed sweet potatoes was a clever twist on an old classic, that fit the budget of black families in the 1960s. Instead of pricey white potatoes, sweet potatoes from the garden were boiled, mashed, and spread on top of a filling made from scraps of meat and vegetables. My grandmother would use whatever was left, bits of beef, chicken, or even pork, chopped small and cooked with onions, carrots, or peas until it formed a savory base. The sweet potato topping baked into a golden layer that balanced the salty meat with a touch of natural sweetness. It was hearty enough to fill everyone, but cheap enough to make even during lean weeks. Sweet potatoes were plentiful in many southern gardens, and they stretched farther than most vegetables because they were filling and rich in flavor. Shepherd's pie with mashed sweet potatoes was more than just food. It was a statement of ingenuity. Families made do with what they had and still put something warm and comforting on the table. That golden crust represented thrift and care, carrying both survival and love in every spoonful. Hoghead cheese was a triumph of resourcefulness, transforming every part of the animal into a dish of surprising elegance. After a hog was butchered, the head was simmered slowly with onions, herbs, and spices until the meat fell from the bone. The rich broth was strained and cooled, setting into a savory jelly that held tender shreds of meat and subtle seasoning. Sliced and served cold with crackers or bread, it became a delicacy at gatherings where nothing was wasted and flavor was celebrated. Making it required patience and skill, with families sharing techniques that varied from one household to the next. Children watched the slow process with a mix of curiosity and awe, learning that thrift could create unexpected pleasures. Today, few people undertake the labor of hoghead cheese, and store-bought versions lack the character of the homemade original, but its history endures as a testament to resilience and the deep respect African-American cooks held for every gift the animal provided. Wild rice pudding combined indigenous grains with African-inspired preparation to create a dish both nourishing and subtly sweet. Wild rice grew naturally in shallow lakes and slow rivers, and enslaved families near these wetlands harvested the dark grains with paddles and baskets, drying them in the sun for year-round use. Cooked slowly in water until tender, the rice was stirred with a bit of sorghum syrup or honey if available, making a warm pudding that supplied protein and lasting energy. Its nutty flavor and satisfying texture turned a simple bowl into a special treat, especially when fresh fruit or spices could be added. This recipe carried forward after emancipation as African-American cooks continued to value wild rice for festive meals and family gatherings. Modern chefs still celebrate its earthy richness, but the story behind wild rice pudding honors the blend of native and African foodways that sustained people through scarcity and created a dessert that is at once humble and deeply rooted in the shared history of America's wetlands and kitchens. Okra and tomato succotash brought color and heritage together in one bubbling skillet. Fresh okra pods, sliced thin, mingled with sweet ripe tomatoes, corn kernels, onions, and peppers, creating a medley that linked West African traditions with Native American harvests. The dish simmered until the vegetables melded into a savory stew, thickened naturally by the okra's silken texture. Farmers' markets once overflowed with the ingredients every late summer, and families counted on succotash to stretch their crops and fill their tables. It was a side dish that could stand as a main course when meat was scarce, and its bright flavors paired beautifully with cornbread or rice. Elders told stories of ancestors who carried seeds and memories across oceans and frontiers, weaving history into every spoonful. Though many still grow okra and corn, the slow, careful preparation of true succotash has become rare, replaced by frozen blends and quick sautés that cannot match the patient flavor of the old garden skillet. Sweet corn and onion skillet was the kind of dish that came together quickly, made from what the garden and pantry had to offer. Fresh ears of corn, or sometimes canned when the season had passed, were sliced from the cob and tossed into a hot pan with sliced onions. Lard or bacon fat did the work of bringing flavor, sizzling until the onions browned and the corn caramelized. The smell was sweet and smoky, filling the house with a promise of comfort even before the first bite. It was cheap, it was fast, and it was nourishing, the kind of supper that stretched across countless families trying to make ends meet. My grandmother served it with bread or cornbread, letting the skillet's juices soak into every bite. The simplicity was its strength, just vegetables and fat, transformed into something more than the sum of its parts. Sweet corn and onion skillet reminded everyone that even with little, you could still eat well. If these soul foods reminded you of resilience or sparked a memory, share your story in the comments. Give this video a like and subscribe so we can keep honoring the dishes that carried people through hard times.